A Mirage F1 beating a MiG-29 sounds wrong until you measure the fight by context, not just thrust to weight. The shock is that many desert engagements weren't symmetrical duels at 20,000 feet. We'll show how radar mode selection, terrain masking, and export loadouts turned a mismatch into a systems contest. France's Cyrano IV and 4-1 added modes beyond simple interception, and operators from South Africa to Iraq flew in harsh heat that punished performance margins. Stay as we parse what the airframe did, what the avionics enabled, and where pilot training quietly tilted the ledger. Before we move on, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Most people expect the Mirage F1 to fly like a Mirage 3 with a fresh paint job, but the shoulder-mounted swept wing changes the script before anyone presses a missile trigger. Lift distribution moves, the flaps grow, and the high lift devices run the full span. So rotation speed drops, approach speeds fall, and runways that were marginal for a 3 become usable. That single architectural shift matters in a desert where short, hot strips and crosswinds are routine rather than exceptions. Dassault arrived there by a private venture detour in the 1960s. The deltas had reach and altitude, but ran into hard limits on low-speed handling, takeoff distance, and all-weather interception. The F1 answered that problem set. It retained supersonic reach, but traded pure area rule elegance for practical field performance, more internal fuel, and room for a radar that could do more than chase a blip against a cold sky. It was therefore an airframe built around real basing and real weather, not brochure figures. Set that against a notional MiG-29 with better thrust to weight and, later, agile missiles. On paper, the fulcrum rates higher and accelerates harder. By this point, the question is simple. Where does the F1 extract an edge? Start at the wing and control surfaces. The swept planform at the shoulder, with larger flaps and those full-span devices, generates lift at lower speeds and keeps the aircraft docile in the flare. Reports credit substantially shorter runway needs and lower approach speeds than the IIIE. Add the increased fuel volume in the wing and fuselage, and the F1 carries longer legs into the sortie without hanging tanks every time, which keeps drag down when you want to be clean and quick. The avionics package pushes the concept further. The Thomson CSF Cyrano IV family brings air target modes, ground mapping, and terrain avoidance. The 4-1 adds a limited look down. That mix gives pilots route choices. You can thread valleys and low ridgelines with radar terrain modes and arrive where you need to be with less exposure to look-down detection. It is like choosing a shaded side street to stay out of the sun while everyone else scans the highway. Engine numbers sit in a sensible bracket. The Snecma Atar 9K50 produces roughly 69 kilonewtons in afterburner. Top speed sits around Mach 2.2 at altitude with a ceiling to about 20,000 meters. Those figures read solid, but the design favors endurance and short field margins over headline climb. In any case, that balance aligns with the radar and wing choices. By way of example, a low-level ingress using terrain masking, guided by ground mapping and terrain avoidance cues, can place an F1 inside a look-down gap. The intercept unfolds on the F1's timing, at a range suited to a short-range shot, rather than an extended rate fight where a higher thrust platform enjoys the initiative. Weapons fit stays flexible. Two 30mm DIFA cannons sit in the roots. Early fits carried R530. Later fleets employed Super 530F, R550 Magic, and, for some exports, Sidewinders. Operators tailored pylons to mission and inventory, and the airframe tolerated mixed stores up to substantial loads. So the payoff is clear: an avionics-led multi-role design with longer range and broader runway access. We can now move on to the hot, dusty airspace where that logic faced hard testing. The surprise is not that claims disagree. It is that radar mode choices and mission tasking created different truths that both align with what pilots actually saw from the cockpit. An F1 EQ set to ground mapping and terrain avoidance will present a different track picture than a fighter scanning in lookdown. And if you add heat haze and ground clutter, you end up with two coherent narratives that do not reconcile on a single tally sheet. Iraqi F1 EQs flew through two separate wars. First in the Iran-Iraq War, then in the Gulf War. The sortie mix was wide. Intercepts against Iranian F-4s and F-5s, escorts and interdiction, and maritime strikes where AIM-39 Exocet fit under the fuselage and turned a land-based jet into a sea denial platform. By this point, the aircraft was not a specialist. It executed whatever the daily frag required. Avionics and weapons fits tracked that variety. Cyrano radar variants offered air-to-air search plus ground mapping and terrain avoidance. R-550 Magic was the common short-range missile. Super 530 appeared in limited cases for longer reach. And for anti-ship work, the AIM-39 Exocet defined the profile. The internal 30mm DIFA cannons remained the constant, because even in radar clutter, you still want a close-in option that does not depend on seeker logic. Operations in desert conditions imposed hard limits. Base dispersal kept jets alive but stretched maintenance and logistics. Sand ingestion risk forced careful throttle management on the ground and during low-level transitions. Heat-trimmed engine margins so takeoff runs grew and climb rates sagged. Ground-controlled interception filled the awareness gap at low altitude. But that reliance meant the quality of vectors and radio discipline could decide whether an intercept closed or collapsed. Tactics adapted accordingly. Crews used low-level ingress to hide in the return, then executed pop-up profiles to take a shot or to release an exocet before dropping back into the mask. That geometry aimed to complicate look-down/shoot-down timelines, compress decision windows, and keep the egress short. It was therefore a playbook built to minimize exposure rather than to court a prolonged maneuvering fight. Verifying outcomes was messy. Logs were incomplete or fragmented. Both sides used propaganda. Losses that looked like air-to-air kills sometimes traced back to surface-to-air missiles, and multi-axis strikes produced misidentifications that persisted in official claims. You can add up numbers, but if you do, you still face attribution ambiguity that does not clear even decades later. A MiG-29's thrust looks decisive on paper, and later fits with high off-bore sight missiles extend that threat. But the duel changes the moment the fight becomes a radar and geometry problem the Mirage F1 can solve first. The apparent mismatch is clear enough. Twin engines and a higher thrust-to-weight, newer avionics anchored by the N019 radar, and agile short-range weapons. The F1 is older, single-engine, and carries a radar family designed for multi-role routing as much as interception. So the question is not capability in isolation. It is who shapes the first detection and the first shot. The fight rarely starts co-altitude with equal awareness. Low-level transit denies long look-down windows. Heat and ground clutter push opposing radars toward range-gated filters that can be gamed by timing. The Cyrano's ground mapping and terrain avoidance modes do not win by raw range. They win by letting the F1 stitch a route through folds and ridgelines that keep the jet below the horizon until the intercept chain is already short. GCI makes that practical. Controllers vector an F1 along a narrow corridor where a climb at the last minute places the target within seeker limits without offering a long warning. In desert air, thermal gradients and dust make look-down performance less forgiving, so late pop-ups exploit degraded situational awareness. It was therefore a problem set where disciplined headings and altitudes matter more than sustained rate. External stores tilt the balance further. A clean Mirage F1 with two magics accelerates and sustains turns better than the same jet with tanks and mixed ordnance. If the MiG-29 launches with a centerline tank and a full air-to-air fit, drag and mass shave its instantaneous advantages at low level, and in heat, the penalty grows. You can sum that up simply. The more pylons and fuel you hang, the shorter the kinematic leash becomes. Training doctrine adds another asymmetry. Some operators taught intercept geometry as a formal sequence: time, speed, heading, and altitude, rather than chasing a rate fight. That discipline compresses merged timelines and forces decisions at ranges where a short-range missile, not sustained turn rate, decides the exchange. Doctrine can invert outcomes when one crew treats the engagement as a navigation problem and the other expects a maneuvering duel. By way of example, the timeline looks like this. An F1 cruises nap of the Earth under Cyrano terrain cues, radio silent, while GCI updates track quality from offboard sensors. At a pre-briefed fix, the controller calls a climb and a slight offset. The F1 pitches up, unloads to gain speed, then rolls level just long enough to cue a magic seeker. The MiG-29's radar, running look down, picks a late, ambiguous return in ground clutter as the F1 crosses the lip. The F1 gets tone first and fires inside a short envelope. The fulcrum has thrust to fight, but the window to use it is already gone. The Mirage F1's legacy sits in outcomes across roles, not a single duel, because avionics and tactics repeatedly converted a statistical underdog into a credible victor. It was therefore a design whose utility scaled with operator discipline and mission planning. So reassess wins by mission effect and verifiable evidence, and ask which other apparent mismatches collapse when context sets the rules. One way or another, performance tables don't capture route choice, sensor employment, or crew training.